Good evening and welcome to Delegate Bagnall's virtual town hall. Thank you all for being here. My name is Luke. I'm just here to give you a couple of housekeeping points real quick before we get started. Again, thanks to all of our panelists for joining us this evening. Delegate Bagnall will introduce them and give you all of their wonderful accomplishments. And it's just my job to remind you that during the meeting, we ask that you stay muted, and if there is a sort of a lag in the video, we would just suggest switching off your video for a short period. That usually helps speed up the stream. But apart from that, if you do have any questions, we certainly would like to hear them. Please place them in the chat and we will try to get to as many of them as we can. Time is limited, so we may not be able to get to all the questions, but we will try to do our best to get to as many of them as we can. But if for any reason we can't address your question, you're more than welcome to send a question directly to the delegate's office, and I will place the email address in the chat. Of course, you can contact the delegate's office with any questions you have in general throughout the year, of course. Other than that, I am happy to introduce to you Delegate Bagnall.
Thank you all so much for joining us today for the 7th of our 2021 legislative session virtual town hall series. I'm Heather Bagnall, your delegate in District 33. I first wanted to thank you all once again for your continued commitment to staying safe by practicing physical distancing and safe protocols, and as we continue to work to more effectively manage the vaccine rollout. It's hard to believe that Monday we sine died, closing on one of the most unique, challenging, and also influential sessions of our 387-year history. Dealing with the multiple crises of COVID, we were tasked also with addressing a long history of inequity, resetting 100 years in a 90-day session. I wanted to wait until after the session to address police reform and criminal justice reform, as halfway through the session, we didn't know what our final package of reforms would look like. Throughout the summer and fall, we watched the watershed of tensions between law enforcement and our communities of color break following the killing of George Floyd, where law enforcement marched both with and against protesters. Even before we gavelled in, we watched with fear and anger as the US Capitol was overrun, and in the weeks following, came to learn that members and former members of law enforcement were involved with the insurrection, which left 2 officers dead and multiple officers injured and traumatized. Even as we grew closer to the end of session, the trauma remained raw as news stations have covered the trial of Derek Chauvin. This is a challenging moment in our history, where our Maryland General Assembly, as well as our law enforcement agencies and communities, are being asked to meet this moment. We weren't just working on police reform, but on a reform of our entire criminal justice system. Tonight, we will talk about the work which was done, the bills which were passed, and what lies ahead. I am honored to be joined tonight by Delegate David Moon from District 20 and a member of the Judiciary Committee and floor leader on a number of the police reform bills in the recent legislative session. Jacqueline Alsop, President of the Anne Arundel County NAACP, and Lydia Walther Rodriguez, the Regional Director of the Baltimore and Central Maryland CASA. I also want to acknowledge Adam Spangler from Congressman Brown's office. Thank you all for being here. As you can imagine, our panelists are very tightly scheduled, so we will attempt to answer all questions, but if we can't get to your question on the call, we will circle back with you to make sure you have answers. And if you're watching on YouTube, please feel free to email any questions to the office. If you have a question and have not submitted it in advance, please also feel free to put your question in the chat. I also wanted to thank Max Pierce, my Chief of Staff, and Luke Tudball, who are once again behind the scenes making me look far more tech savvy than I really am. Following tonight's town hall, please do feel free to email my office and we'll get back to you as quickly as possible. With that, I am honored to introduce Delegate David Moon, my esteemed colleague, who's going to talk a little bit, not just about the legislation that we passed, but the work that preceded it, because for anyone who was watching the General Assembly session, you saw sort of the end product of hours and hours of work that came before. And I know that it was a little more challenging to see the work that preceded it. So Delegate Moon, thank you so much for being here, and thank you for all the work that you did. I know this has been a very challenging and lengthy process getting to this moment.
Thanks, Heather. And I just want to say for your constituents that Delegate Bagnall has hit the ground running. She is an active, thoughtful member of our caucus. And so we're really glad to have her there. And you should be pretty pleased with her representation thus far. So I'm pleased to join you from Montgomery County, where I represent District 20 in the House. I currently serve as the chair of the Criminal Law Subcommittee. And I wanted to just hop in and tell you a little bit about what we did on policing this year and why. And Delegate Bagnall is correct. This was not a hasty decision, no matter the hot feelings that people have about this on either side. This was done after hours and hours and hours of debate and discussion over amendments and countless testimony from all sides. And frankly, it's not just been this year. I was actually on the body since 2015 and was on the House Judiciary Committee when we undertook police reform after the Freddie Gray incident. And so many of the decisions we took this year were guided by what happened then and frankly, the failures of some of the reforms we attempted in that round of police reform. So just a few top lines that I want to tell you. We had a summer work group, bipartisan, and we looked at a range of issues, but in particular, we wanted to make a change to the use of force policy. And so I really think that where we ended up puts us, frankly, on the more restrictive end in the nation now on use of force. And we changed it from allowing force that an officer feels is reasonable to force that is necessary and proportional to the objective. And so, I have to be honest, it's a pretty big change, what we're doing here, but we're really trying to put the valuing of human life, including of suspects and bystanders at the forefront here. So coming with this is the no-knock warrants you've heard so much about. We are no longer allowing them for evidence destruction. Someone's life has to be at stake. And this concept that force really ought to be reserved for when someone's life or at least a very, very serious injury is happening, that's really where we've headed with the use of force standard in Maryland. I also want to say a lot of the stuff that didn't get a lot of airtime and maybe wasn't as heated or controversial is some really basic stuff just to professionalize and modernize the experience people have when encountering police. And so, for example, we're going to start having in 2025 a statewide body cam requirement. I think that's the growing expectation. And on top of that, police are going to have to telling you why they pulled you over. I know that sounds like a radical concept, but when you put the two together, it means that going forward, we're going to have videotaped evidence of the constitutionality of traffic stops and try to put to end some of this racial profiling and the driving while black controversies that have preceded even today's policing debates. So again, this is not new topics. This is just years and years of debate finally coming to a head for us to do something. I'll say two areas that we did have heated debate. One was on disclosure of police complaints. And so we did end up saying that the public is entitled to see the complaints and discipline files of law enforcement officers, even unsustained complaints. And there was some controversy over this, but the fact of the matter is in some departments, we have officers with large numbers of supposed unsustained complaints and others without those huge numbers. And so it really, I think, leads to some questions about what's going on with some of these officers and the command chain. And so we have made it the decision in Maryland that we're going to put some sunlight on that And then lastly, I'll leave you with, we made some pretty substantial changes to how discipline is going to be doled out in Maryland. Under the old system, you essentially had police making decisions about discipline for police. And now we are moving towards a statewide system of uniform discipline where civilians will be applying the same rules across counties so that officers will be disciplined the same. And again, moving away from a system where it's officers making that determination. So that's sort of the basics of it, but there's a lot more detail I could provide, and I'm happy to answer whatever questions folks may have. So thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Delegate Moon. And there were pieces of the reforms that also involved training, and also involved one of the reforms that I was very I was a little disheartened didn't make it over the finish line was actually the protections for law enforcement against retaliation for seeking mental health services, because so often we hear about the need for not just for trauma-informed care and bias training, but for how we address trauma that is experienced by law enforcement. And I felt like we had a really good bill, and it ran out of time. It ran out of time. And I know that some of what we've been doing here in Anne Arundel County was around training, and President Alsop, I wanted to turn to you, because I know that the Anne Arundel County NAACP has really been on the front of the discussions and what we're doing in Anne Arundel County. We were a little bit ahead of the General Assembly in terms of body worn cameras and some of the and looking at some of the use of force questions, and also some of our training. So what has been your experience throughout this whole process?
Well, good evening first. Good evening, everyone. And thank you, Delegate Bagnall, for all the hard work you and your colleagues have done this session, and for allowing me to participate in this town hall meeting. I'm Jacqueline Boone, also president of the NAACP for Anne Arundel County branch, and the second vice president for NAACP Maryland State Conference. We all know what has been going on in this nation. Black people in America are constantly at risk. We must stop the senseless killing of Black men. And around with police reform, the community wants reform. They want transparency, and they want accountability. So I may be stating some of the changes that Delegate Moon just mentioned. But I also would like to say that the NAACP Maryland State Conference is one of the 95 members of the Maryland Coalition for Justice and Police Accountability. And earlier last summer, the coalition had 5 legislative priorities identified as crucial for meaningful police reform in Maryland. And I'll just touch on those 5 priorities. One, of course, we mentioned the repeal of Leobor with real civilian oversight. While the General Assembly replaced the Law Enforcement Officers' Bill of Rights, one of the things that it failed to do was to implement, most importantly, police accountability, and that's with community oversight. Community oversight means that there is community control and operated entity that is internal to the police department, external to the police department, or state imposed process that has power to investigate, adjudicate, and impose discipline. While the HB 670 has aspects of civilian participation in disciplinary process, this is not the same as community oversight. The General Assembly has restored an aspect of Leoboard, which are the trial boards, which have the final say on police discipline. Police chiefs still cannot be held accountable for officers going unpunished for their egregious behavior. Number 2 was the control of the Baltimore City Police Department to Baltimore City residents. After 160 years as a state agency, legislation was passed that sets a path to return the Baltimore City Police Department to being an agency of the city of Baltimore. The legislation calls for the formation of an advisory board to provide direction for the implementation of local control. It requires it being placed on the ballot, and it will likely require further action from the General Assembly to actually enact local control. Third was transparency in police misconduct investigation. Passage of Anton's Law, amending the Maryland Public Information Act to allow public disclosure of records of police misconduct investigations will be transformative. The law was named after a 19-year-old Anton Black, who was killed by police in Greensboro, Maryland. Anton's Law will allow communities to know whether their police departments are appropriately handling complaints of police abuse and punishing misconduct. Fourth is the limiting the use of force by law enforcement. The use of force statute raises the legal standard to authorize force when it is necessary and proportionately based on the totality of the circumstances to prevent imminent threat of physical injury or effectuate a legitimate law enforcement objective. We will have to stay vigilant to evaluate how the courts will interpret this standard to see whether more restrictions will need to be implemented to protect Maryland residents. And fifth is removing police from our children's school. 2 bills that were introduced this session to remove school resource officers from schools and reallocate funding to other crucial school resource did not advance at all. Weeks before the session ended, we all watched the horrifying video in Montgomery County where an officer terrorized a 5-year-old boy. Many testified before the legislature that we would not be satisfied until the community external to the police department had the power to investigate, adjudicate, and impose discipline onto police officers. The legislature failed to do this. Instead, what was included was the Police Accountability Board. The General Assembly has added a new subtitle, Police Accountability and Discipline, to Title III of the Maryland Public Safety Article, which mandates police accountability boards for each county be created, appointing civilian members to charging committees and trial boards. Membership determined by the local legislative body. Active police officers may not be a member of the police accountability body. Lawmakers also limited the use of no-knock warrants, which gained nationwide attention last year after police in Louisville, Kentucky fatally shot Ms. Taylor when they were fired upon after breaking down their apartment door. Officers have said that they first announced their presence, but most witnesses have disagreed. Other changes in Maryland included the requirement that all law enforcement officers who regularly interact with the public must wear body cameras. And in Anne Arundel County, we don't have body cameras yet, but the body cameras have been put into the budget by our county executive, and we're looking forward to that. And it should, that program should be started soon. Officers will also be prohibited from preventing people from recording them as long as that person is acting lawfully and safely. Another change, law enforcement agencies statewide must establish a system to identify police officers who are considered likely to use excessive force and to retrain them, counsel them, or if needed, reassign them. This session, the new leadership of the General Assembly sent a clear message. A better way forward is possible. Never before had our communities heard a Speaker of the House stand with us against police brutality. We are grateful for the progress that was made. We know that the work is not done in this session. More than ever, we were reminded of the power of the people to demand what is right. We will continue to fight in and with communities for policies that are fair, equitable, and valuing all lives. Transparency in policing will remain at the forefront of the NAACP's agenda. We believe all men should be treated equally in all communities. The Maryland General Assembly enacted on policies for the 21st century that will be of benefit for the citizens of Maryland. And we thank you for that.
Thank you so much, President Alsup. And I think you make a great point that this is just the first step. And what's both gratifying and distressing is that we are the first in the nation. And it really, it's hard to realize that that it took so much to get here. And I want to turn to Ms. Walther Rodriguez now, because when we talk about criminal justice reform, and we're really talking about more than police reform, we're talking about comprehensive criminal justice reform. We can't ignore sort of the elephant in the room, which is that we still have, until this legislative session, we still have a private for-profit prison system in Maryland, despite the fact that we as citizens of Maryland don't want for-profit prisons. We still had for-profit prisons through our immigration system. And I wanted to give you the opportunity to speak to the work that CASA did, in working with the Dignity Not Detention bill and the Driver's Safety Act, which protected the information of our Maryland residents.
Absolutely, and thank you so much for having us here today. I want to echo also some of the words that President Alsup lifted up in police reform. CASA also joined the over 95 organizations under the umbrella of MCJPA on the state level to fight and advocate for police reform, because we know that our worlds are intersectional, and our members have additionally suffered police violence, and we have been fighting alongside many activists, advocates, and mothers who have lost sons for over a decade. And I want to just uplift, a lot of the words that she mentioned and said, that the fight is not over yet. There's much that we need to continue to fight for. We've had members, we had a community member in Annapolis who testified, and many members who have been brutalized by police. One of our members in Annapolis essentially there was excessive use of force when they attempted to detain him. And through the detaining of him, they realized that it was actually the wrong person that they were detaining. They were looking for someone else. And he was hospitalized due to the use of force that they were using on him to try to detain him. And due to his immigration status, there was a lot of fear of reporting this incident. And this uplifts the importance of changing that law to use of force, but also this victory of MPIA is really relevant in our immigrant community as well, as we've had a young man from our immigrant community in Prince George's County who was actually brutalized and hospitalized by police. And the officer was actually trying to charge him, even though charge him unjustly. And the only reason that the case was dropped essentially was because the young man was able to get an attorney. And we found out that the officer had actually shot and killed a Latinx community member in Prince George's County, and he didn't want that to come to light. And the importance of officers' misconduct being part of MPIA is important to ensure a community can advocate and ensure that there is true justice and reform against officers. And again, you know, we together collaboratively pushed and have won some milestones in Maryland, but there's still a lot to go. We're in the right direction, but this was really the people collective power. There's still so much to go for us to continue to fight for so many mothers, children, and stories of community members who continue to face this violence by police in our state. In terms of the dignity, not detention, right? This was a historic victory for us because we have seen how many in our state, different jurisdiction and municipalities have actually profited from the misery of immigrant community members by being detained in these private prisons. And this has essentially continued to separate families and continue to have different municipalities partner and collaborate with ICE, something that does not need to happen. And essentially what it causes is mistrust between immigrant community members and the state that they call their home, the state that most of them have been here for so many years, decades. And we need to ensure through this victory, we're able to ensure that community members do not have to fear going to the hospitals. They do not have to fear going to schools and don't have to fear that police are collaborating with ICE anywhere in the state of Maryland. Additionally, we were able to win the NVA bill, which essentially puts security into driver's license system and database in the NVA. In 2013, we won the driver's license regardless of your immigration status here in the state of Maryland. And over 40,000 immigrant community members applied for a driver's license. And we saw and witnessed how the federal level was using this database unjustly to target and harass our immigrant community members. And as the uptake on the federal level of detentions increased, we saw so many immigrant community members fearful that they had a driver's license and they were left vulnerable in the system. We were able to win the driver's license, the improvement of the MPIA to limit the ability for the federal government to go inside the MVA database without having a warrant. And this is something that we want to ensure it happens through implementation, because not having a warrant limits the ability for excessive misuse of the database to track down immigrant community members and allows them to feel safe having that driver's license. So all of this goes hand in hand into a huge victory for us. We still have a ways to go, but this is a huge step in the right direction for immigrant community members, both for the driver's license, dignity not detention, and also in the fight as we join our brothers and sisters in the police reform activism.
Thank you so much. And I think you hit the nail on the head with talking about the intersectionality of these policies. When we were addressing dignity not detention, I actually went back to the words of our former police chief, because of course in 2018, our county executive ran on ending the 287G program here in Anne Arundel County, and we already were limited in its utilization, but our former police chief actually said this about the program. He said, "The job of county police is to keep people in Anne Arundel County safe. I'm here today to tell you we can do that job better without 287G in place. We need communities to trust the police to help us solve crimes, not fear us because they are worried their friend or family may be detained or deported." And I think we keep coming back to that question of mistrust breeds, it makes us less safe. That trust in our law enforcement, trust in our communities makes our community safer. And I think, Delegate Moon also touched on the fact that a lot of the debate around these policy changes was a question of life over property, that we need to prioritize life before we're prioritizing property, and that we will always have another chance to find the evidence, but we won't have another chance at preserving life. So I wanted to turn back to Delegate Moon because we did have a question in the chat about who was consulted. Was there the National Association of Police Organizations, Keep Maryland Safe, Anne Arundel Fraternal Order of Police, and you were on that work group. That we had witnesses and stakeholders. So if you can speak to some of that work and who the stakeholders were. I know that we don't necessarily all agree on the policy, but I believe there were a lot of voices in that room.
Yeah, and so let me just say that this issue brought out fireworks, to be perfectly frank. There were a range of opinions, and really we undertook so many different issues: the civil liability, the criminal, the training, 100 different aspects were looked at in the last year. And we really did have the chiefs, the sheriffs, the FOP, the ACLU, advocates really from the whole spectrum were discussed, consulted with, and at the table during all of this. Ultimately, we had to take votes. And so, yeah, I think not everyone was pleased with the final outcome. There was a specific question about military and law enforcement involvement. Some of the floor leaders actually and prime sponsors of the legislation were veterans and military members. We had members of both on the floor and in committee from law enforcement, from both parties actually. We have a Democratic and a Republican member of law enforcement on. Sorry, my internet connection is getting shaky. Let me just move. Apologies, folks.
How we know it's live.
I was just saying we do have law enforcement and former law enforcement in both chambers. They were actually, to be frank about it, through the process, I probably come more from the police reform side of it. And so the law enforcement members of the Assembly were very active and vocal in making some of the amendments and suggested amendments to the bill. And look, at the end of the day, I know there's been a lot of talk about this being seen as sort of a punitive effort, and I really don't think that's the case. That I think when you look at it, when you really look at some of the changes we made, Delegate Bagnall pointed to one of them in particular, that this concept of putting property over life. And literally as we were debating this legislation in my district in Tacoma Park, we had a terrible case where an off-duty Pentagon law enforcement officer thought he witnessed, and maybe he did, I don't know, a auto theft happening in the parking lot of the building that he was in. And he came out, confronted the folks, again, off duty, not in his jurisdiction, and they fled. And he shot them both in the back and killed them both. And so, this sort of culture and this sort of putting property up front like that, I really think it's problematic, and it's sort of at the forefront of what we're trying to change here. Again, we're not trying to jeopardize anyone's lives, but I will tell you, I really believe that what we're doing is making things safer for everyone, because those no-knock warrants are also dangerous for the officers. Essentially you're asking to kick the door down at all manner of the night. This has been going on for folks who have no idea that it's a law enforcement officer coming at their door. And so some of those folks, again, we had someone in Montgomery County killed this year in a no-knock raid. And so there are lawsuits happening over this sort of things. So I really think, again, it's the public safety of everyone. And I'll give you one last example before I move on. Also from Montgomery County, also recent, we had a firefighter from Montgomery County who had his door kicked down in a no-knock raid. He's suing the county right now. His grandmother, his elderly grandmother, had a catheter and was held at gunpoint, again in the middle of the night. And it turns out they wanted a basement tenant who had just moved in to their a separate unit that was not accessible from the upstairs, and it was for a drug charge of some sort. And the officers apparently had ample opportunity to apprehend this individual because they were observing them over a period of time. So again, I tell you, when you look at some of the cases we've dealt with and the careful study we undertook here, I know that the headlines seem shocking about what we did, but when you really look at the detail of what we're asking here, it is a reimagining and a rebooting of policing. But I really think when all is said and done, it's ought to end up with a re-engagement and reinstilling of confidence and public trust between law enforcement and the community. So I think we're going to end up a stronger community on the other side of this.
I would tend to agree. And I think it's also, it speaks to everyone understanding the rules and us all operating from the same set of rules. President Alsop, I saw you on mute, so I have a sense that you have you want to chime in here. So please.
When you first
you just remuted.
Yeah, when I saw the question in the chat about asking if any of us have served as military or law enforcement, which I have not, but I have had family members who was a law enforcement officer. And I have had encounters with police officers who have been in the community doing community policing. And those officers were there to protect and serve. So there are police officers out there that are that the community does trust, but then you have those few bad ones that put shit that's which results in a lot of the dissension that goes on within some of our communities.
Thank you so much. And I think that's a great point, because we keep hearing that phrase, it's a few bad apples, but the toll of that is so severe that we can't simply wipe it away as though it's inconsequential. And I wanted to, President Alsop, I actually wanted to circle back on something that we're challenged as we're looking at criminal justice reform. We're not just looking at policing, we're not just looking at transparency, but we're also looking at what is the role of our criminal justice system. And I think we took on a lot of heavy lifts this year in really questioning, is it about rehabilitation? Is it about incarceration? And one of the really challenging debates that we had was on the Juvenile Restoration Act, because Maryland has the notorious role of being #1 in incarcerating Black men ages 18 to 24. And when we look at our criminal justice system and we question the prison to, the school to prison pipeline, the Juvenile Restoration Act really said, that we need to question whether or not we should just be warehousing people for the rest of their lives. And I wanted to ask you about the work that you see the NAACP doing in terms of criminal justice reforms for our incarcerated community.
Well, let me share with you one of the activities of our Juvenile Justice Committee that we have. The chair of our Juvenile Justice Committee meets with those incarcerated young ladies on a monthly basis here in Maryland and in Anne Arundel County, and provide mentorship and guidance to those young ladies on a regular basis. At Waxter Center, since COVID, we've been doing it virtually, but prior to that, we've been going into the centers, and at each meeting, there is a key speaker. There's a speaker where the youth, these young girls, get to ask questions and benefit from the program that we have provided for them. I think re-entry is extremely important. We need more services for people who are coming out of the prison system and returning back to society, having those resources there to assist those individuals. We just hired a new superintendent for the Anne Arundel County prison system that we have here. And it's my hope that there will be some initiations of new programs and resources for those individuals that are returning back to the community.
Thank you so much. And we had a question, I wanted to segue to the question that's in the chat, which is around the school resource officers, and if there would be changes in Anne Arundel County. And I don't have a hard and fast answer for that, because as the contributor was on a previous town hall that we had, where we talked about the work of the school resource officers and the diversion programs. And we've just started a new diversion program in Anne Arundel County, which is at the front end before there's a citation, before there's a record of any kind created, but it's just a pilot, because right now it's only funded for part of the county. It's not yet countywide. But the legislation that we passed in the General Assembly that spoke to school resource officers actually spoke to the best practices that were already in Anne Arundel County in ensuring that resource officers were being used as a resource and not as disciplinarians. So I don't think there are going to be specific changes from this legislative session, but I do believe that we are going to continue to look at that program and the intersectionality of our behavioral health services, our law enforcement, and our educational facilities. And I'm sorry, I don't have a more comprehensive answer at this time, but we're still trying to figure out how some of these policies are going to impact us at the micro level. And I don't know if any of the panelists have more information on that, but I think that's probably as accurate as we're going to get it tonight. Okay, that's what I thought. I don't see more questions in the panel, but I did want to circle back. Delegate Moon, I know I keep putting you on the hot seat tonight, but you were so much on the sort of on the front lines of the work that was done this summer. Well, I was on the behavioral health side and the COVID side in health and government operations. So I did want to give you an opportunity to speak a little bit to the stakeholders and the work that was done around the Juvenile Restoration Act, because I think, again, if you watch the debate, it was a little confusing as to what that bill really was intended to do. And I really believe it was very much a a questioning of what is the role of our criminal justice system, and how do we ensure that that again we're preserving life, that we're prioritizing life.
Sure, happy to talk about that. So this is one of the most difficult topics we dealt with this year. And, let me be perfectly frank, I've been in the body since 2015. This is my 7th session in Annapolis. And one of the things I ran on was this concept of unwinding the fact of the US having the world's largest prison population, a huge bevy of nonviolent offenders, and what some have termed mass incarceration. So I undertook to work on that for the last few years. And when I first got there, we did a lot on the criminalization of poverty and how different driving offenses and fines and tickets can land you in jail. Drug offenders we started working on, and people with parole violations. And then we got to people who haven't been convicted yet because they're pretrial and they're awaiting their date. And you start to work through that, and we did. And we started to thin out the population. And eventually you get to a question about folks who maybe actually did it. And these are violent offenders. And the courts started asking questions about this. Well, what if they were juveniles at the time of the offense? What does that mean? And so, the brain science started to get discussed quite a bit, both from the perspective of, impulse control and other factors. And then also on the back end of it, what happens over time to people who have been incarcerated, and frankly, this concept of people aging out of crime. And when you look at the data there, by the time, even serious criminals hit their 50s and 60s, they're not really committing crimes anymore. And so this large policy question loomed in front of us for years, and states one by one started eliminating this concept of sentencing children to the possibility of life without parole. And so this bill started moving this year in Maryland, and I can tell you just a little bit about what it does and what the conversation was like. And again, we are talking about some very serious offenses. This is murder, sex assault, and some it can be some very violent crimes that happened. On the other end of it, Maryland has rules like the felony murder rule, which allows people to be charged with murder that were not in fact the murderer. And so we do have rules like that, which basically, the concept from the old English common law was that this will deter you from getting involved with the wrong crowd, right? That if you don't go hang out with folks and get involved in a robbery, if one of your friends goes nuts and kills someone, you're all responsible and will be charged as such. And so, that's the underpinning of the rule. But as you can imagine, when you apply it, we've had scenarios where people have been charged with murder and gotten more time than the actual murderer, or people who have been apprehended by the police and in police custody at the time the murder happened, and nevertheless was charged with murder. So there's all sorts of unusual results. And again, there are other folks who actually did do it. So this is the whole range. I just want to be very fair to the conversation we were having.
And I think that's important because again, it's far more comprehensive than what we see in a 30-minute debate on the floor.
Yeah, no, that's right. And frankly, on the floor debate, it's a lot of people are trying to make splashy statements. I just want to be honest about what we were dealing with. And so the bill that ended up passing going forward will stop this concept of sentencing people who are juveniles at the time to life without the possibility of parole. They may do quite a bit of time, to be to be perfectly frank. But this concept is rooted in the idea that the state does not consider any child irredeemable, right? That's really the philosophical and legal underpinning to this, that all children have a hope of redemption. Again, you can agree or disagree with it. I'm just telling you that's where we landed on it. And so that still leaves one last question. Well, there are folks that have already been charged with life without the possibility of parole in Maryland and are already serving time, again, sometimes for some very serious, very violent crimes. And it left a question about what to do with folks that already got tagged with this. And so the compromise that was landed upon was to, in their life, after they've served decades in prison, to give them the opportunity to ask 3 times in their life for a judge to look at the sentence that was given. And the judge then ticks through a list of factors that will allow them to even entertain this, whether there's actual signs of rehabilitation or evidence of potential recidivism. Have they been doing the things they were asked behind bars, et cetera? So that's where it landed. I don't expect that means people who apply are just going to be let out. In fact, probably most will not. But that was the way of answering that question. It's very heated because for some of the cases where someone's not going to be let out, the victim or victims or victim's family nevertheless are going to be notified of this hearing, not once, not twice, but 3 times. And so there was a big debate over amendments about how many times one should be allowed to pursue this revisiting of the sentence. Unlimited, every year, 1 time, and 3 was the number that we landed on.
And I appreciate that. And this is a limited community then that would even be impacted by this bill because of the other work that we did. That's correct. So that population is going to dwindle, and eventually this bill will basically be obsolete. But it captures that population. And I know it's challenging on how to land with the right policy that also doesn't re-traumatize people. And that is the challenge that we are tasked with all of these policies. We had a couple questions in the chat, and Ms. Walter Rodriguez, I'm going to turn back to you, and President Alsup. There was a question about, I don't think it's a question about fighting against police for the sake of criminals. I'm not sure that that's really where we are, but I didn't want to not address this question because I think it centers around the question of police officers and their fear of lack of due process. And if you can speak to the work on again how we find that middle ground.
Absolutely, and I think it's important to uplift the importance of the bills that were passed, but also the fight from advocates, from directly impacted community members who have lost loved ones to the hands of police. And these bills and continued advocacy for reform is coming from a place to ensure accountability for officers who are committing misconduct against community members, and also to ensure accountability when an officer is doing misconduct, brutalization, or even kills a community member in community. And we have seen time and time again victims of police brutality, victims at the hands of police. And we have asked and continue to advocate for equal justice for citizens, for officers to get the same treatment that we have. Everyday citizens get the same rights, and they are not above the law. when we are talking about next steps after there's been brutalization, next steps after they've killed a member in the community, and next steps after there has been misconduct. As we talk about transparency, the importance of continuing to reform a system that systemically has failed us in this state, particularly for community members to seek justice after misconduct, brutalization, or even someone in their family has been killed, because the system itself needs the reforming and the transparency to continue advocating. So these bills that have been passed this legislative session, and so many more of the reforms that we're advocating for, allow for the accountability and the justice that we're seeking for loved ones who have lost their lives at the hands of police.
And I think Ms. Rodriguez has stated exactly what it is that we're advocating for. I did use the word fight when I was speaking earlier, and fight as meaning advocating for people. When you think about the voting rights, we are a civil rights organization, and we advocate for the civil rights of all people within Anne Arundel County. And when those rights are violated, sometimes it feels like you're in a fight when you're trying to get a systematic change to occur.
I think that's absolutely true, and it is it's the constant struggle to make change, and I'm very proud of the work that we did, but as I was talking to Delegate Moon, I said it feels like we've just scratched the surface, but it's a deep scratch. So we know we have a lot more work to do. There was also a question about program for redemption, and I'm going to start with this one because it's not one answer. And I think President Alsop, you touched on this earlier, that redemption and rehabilitation, again, are a comprehensive issue, from resources before people commit crimes. I had a bill which was the Mental Health Access Initiative, which allowed adolescents to consent for mental health services, because if there is a barrier to care, and often that barrier is fear, we have a mechanism now to remove that barrier. The pre-release programs are another really important aspect of that rehabilitation. Mental health services in the facilities are another really important part of that. The role of our schools in making sure that we're stopping that school to prison pipeline is another aspect of that. So it is by far not one simple or single answer to this much more systemic issue. And in all honesty, we have spent more than 4 decades de-investing in behavioral health services, de-investing in our communities, de-investing in the poverty gap, the equity gaps, the education gaps, and we're having to address all of that. And although it isn't part of our police reform package, it's not part of our criminal justice package, it is part and parcel to actually effectively reforming our criminal justice system. And if anyone else wants to add on, feel free. But you know, my piece of it is in that health universe. And then we have pieces of it that are in the education universe. And a lot of it is not in the judicial universe because it's all of the other wraparound resources. One of the bills that we had this year was trauma-informed care, which is probably one of the most significant investments we can make in our adolescent populations, because the more adverse childhood experiences you experience, the more likely you are to actually die at an earlier age, because you are not dealing with all of these external traumas that that impact your life and impact your development as, you know, from adolescence to adulthood. So there is a broad range of initiatives that we have in terms of addressing rehabilitation and redemption, including, as I mentioned before, the SMART program from our Anne Arundel County resource officers, which is an attempt to redirect adolescents when they have a behavioral issue in the schools, to make sure not only do they not have a record, which could impact them going forward, but also they are reinvesting in their own communities and they are utilizing their own skills. So it's a huge issue, and it's a huge challenge, because dealing comprehensively with rehabilitation and behavioral health comes with a big price tag, and everybody wants to support it until that invoice comes due. I think Ms. Walther Rodriguez too spoke earlier to that need for communities to feel safe. And that's that's part of the issue too, is we have to have policies that make everyone feel safe, everyone feel protected, and everyone feel like they are an important part of the community.
I can put a little extra color into that also.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the parallel I mean, I used to be the juvenile law chair, and that, you know, in shorthand, that was the juvie chair, because I was dealing with kids that were coming up through the system before they put me on the criminal law chair, and I started dealing with the adults in the system. And so I can tell you, you know, that we've been trying to move towards a model of diversion and decarceration of our juvenile population. And we had an interesting experience both with our adult population and the juvenile population during the pandemic. I would say, you know, if you the cabinet head for Hogan for juvenile services saw this as a unannounced experiment, essentially, where we for public health reasons tried to get all the kids out of the facilities, and lo and behold, with both these populations and the adult population, we didn't see some explosion of crime from the folks that were let out. And so it sort of raises interesting questions about how much of this was necessary. And so, you know, we tried to move towards this approach in many aspects of the state's dealings, as I was alluding to earlier with our pretrial population, for example. It used to be under the old cash bail system, oh, you know, here, post $10,000, and we know that means you post $1,000 or $500, and, you know, a bondsman will post the rest, and then you get out. And we said, well, wait a second, does this actually correlate to anything? Was that person actually a public safety threat? Were they a flight risk? Why do we have that belief? Is that based on anything? And we're trying to move towards more of an evidence-based approach on that, you know, to be clear. And so where we saw this linking back to this whole concept that Delegate Bagnall was just talking to this year, we started taking a look at education behind bars and whether this has an impact on what happens out in the world. And so we did two things. One, the Hogan folks came in and they actually asked us to double the amount of mandatory education people have to do behind bars if they don't have a GED yet. And, you know, part of the reason for it is when we look at the recidivism rates of folks coming out with some education, they're far less likely to commit an additional crime than had they not had that education. So that was fairly uncontroversial. Then we got to another population, and we had another bill that was about, it basically allowed good time credits to let people behind bars take a little bit time off their sentence if they entered into a college, if they finished a college degree program, either a 2-year or a 4-year or graduate program behind bars. And there was initially a lot of pushback to this. The same thing, people said, that person did something really bad. I don't want them coming out any earlier. They should do the time that was assigned to them. And then we had other folks say, we need truth in sentencing. You know, if the judge said 20 years and 20 days, that's what it's got to be. No questions asked. And part of the problem with it was that I hate to just be very honest about how this works, but without the incentive of that extra time, fewer people behind bars were taking advantage of the college programs that were being offered to them. And you might say, well, that's on them. Who cares? Well, here's why it matters. The folks I'm talking about have a release date. Eventually, they are going to be dumped back to our communities. And again, all of the evidence says that they are 30 or 40% less likely to commit an additional crime when they are released if we had pushed them to get that college education behind the bars. So yes, it is a cost to our pride in our morals and to our sense of punishment to let them out 10, 20, 30 days early off their sentence. But really, even if you have the most selfish motive, you can say that they're being dumped back into our communities and we're going to be safer because of it.
Thank you. I think that's a great point. And you know, it made me think of something else that we also did, which I think is important as part of this conversation, because, you know, we have looked at how to decriminalize substance use, because we know that is an illness. And you know, we established our drug courts and diversion programs. But something that we did this year was looking at those crisis intervention teams statewide. And in Anne Arundel County, we have an incredible crisis intervention team, which actually just won an award as best in the world. And in Anne Arundel County, it is a partnership between health and law enforcement, but their primary focus is what they call early positive intervention. And when you were talking about the numbers of making people safer, making communities safer when people are released back into the community, and that they're 30 and 40% less likely to commit crimes, the crisis intervention teams have seen a 97% success rate in non-recidivism for up to a year, which in behavioral health is a very, very long time, for these early positive interventions. And I think that we keep coming back to that. You know, the trauma-informed care is an early positive intervention. The crisis intervention teams is an early positive intervention, and diversion and keeping people out of the criminal justice system as much as possible. And instead looking at resources and looking at the root causes of why people commit crimes in the first place. And I think that's an important piece to touch on, because again, it's not part of that reform package, but it is a really important piece of the reform of our criminal justice system. And I'm looking at the time. I want to make sure that I'm being conscious of everybody's time. So I want to give everyone an opportunity to give our panelists an opportunity for some final thoughts. And I do want to say once again, thank you so much for being here. I know that this is just the beginning of this work, but I do think that this was a response to a watershed moment. It was the General Assembly trying to meet this moment, and in a 90-day session. And I hope that it will put Maryland on a path to being a national leader in this universe. So thank you once again. Ms. Walther Rodriguez, any final thoughts?
Absolutely, and thank you so much for again having having us tonight. I think just to conclude, again, celebrating the success of the people. This was really a people power movement that got us to this point, and the people will continue to push to ensure that we get to a place where we are not losing an implementation and continuing to lose lives, not just here in our state, but across our country.
Thank you so much. President Alsop, your final thoughts on where we are and where we go.
Again, thank you, Delegate Bagnall, for having me as a part of this town hall meeting. And I am happy and pleased to see that there were changes made at the Maryland General Assembly. There were laws that will pass that will really help those individuals in our communities. And it will also protect the rights of many of the individuals in our communities. And we thank you for that.
Well, thank you so much for your leadership and your advocacy. And Ms. Walter Rodriguez, thank you so much for your advocacy. You're absolutely right. This was very much a people-driven movement, and we saw people march in the streets, and then we saw them march to the polls, and we heard you loud and clear. We heard our communities loud and clear. Delegate Moon, I'm going to give you final thoughts.
Well, I'll actually piggyback off of your final thoughts, because while the discipline aspect has gotten all of the attention, we really have been having this other conversation about crisis intervention, mental health, behavioral health, substance abuse, homelessness, and I could go on and on about all of the different challenges that we need to tackle if we're really looking at the big picture here. It sort of stands out to me. I was having this informal conversation with the police chief on the shore years ago, and I had asked frankly about whether they felt we had the proper mental health infrastructure in place, and they told me about how if there was someone having a behavioral health crisis, they would take them to the hospital. They'd be discharged within 2 days. They'd take them back. The hospital wouldn't take them back because they're uninsured. And so this person ended up getting locked up for loitering or trespassing or something like that. And the chief themselves admitted that this was a terrible outcome, but this person apparently had been acting dangerously. And so I tell that story just to circle back to this larger concept that, I think we've landed in this very adversarial dynamic when it comes to policing. And, some of it's healthy, some of it's emotional, and some of it's long overdue. But there's this larger question about, whether we haven't set ourselves up for failure in many respects by having police do this long list of jobs, some of which they're qualified to do and some of which they're not, and why we haven't had the wherewithal to build out the infrastructure for the alternatives. So that's a question that I'll just let hang there because I think we haven't met that challenge yet. And so I think on that, we're going to have to all get together, put our heads together, put our efforts together, and make sure it's a priority. And not just because we're fighting about police discipline, but because that's the way for a healthier society.
Thank you so much. I think that's a great place to leave it, because I think that is where my heart and soul lies is in addressing these long historic inequities in disinvestment in our communities, and the physical and mental and emotional and psychological well-being of our communities and financial well-being of our communities. So I just want to thank everyone once again for being on this call. This is not the end of this conversation. We know it's just the beginning. This is just the beginning of the work that we're going to do. But to Delegate Moon's point too, we have to make sure that we are positioning all law enforcement to enforce the law and not asking them to do everything else. And we have to position our communities to not fear law enforcement, but to be a part of community policing and a part of keeping our community safe instead of this adversarial experience. So thank you all so much. For those of you that are watching, we have one more town hall coming up next week. We will be we have a veterans town hall. We'll be talking about some of the legislation that we passed during the session, and then I will be scheduling a legislative roundup for all the things that we did, which is a very long list. So thank you once again. I'm going to turn it over to my partner to close us out.
Thanks again, everyone, for being here, and especially want to thank, of course, all of our panelists and all of their wonderful expertise and knowledge. We really do appreciate that. All of our guests on YouTube and all of our guests following along, of course, on all the social media. If there was a question that we weren't able to get to, or a topic that you would like us to take on in a future town hall, or just any questions or issues that you have that you'd like the delegate's office to deal with, please do email the delegate's office, of course, which I put in the email there, but the email is heather.bagnall@house.state.mdu.us. You can also go ahead and visit the website, which is heatherbagnall.com, and follow us on social media, of course. Please join us next week for the Veterans Issues Town Hall. And I would be remiss if I didn't also thank, of course, our fabulous host, Delegate Bagnall. So thank you all for being here, and we look forward to seeing you again very soon.
And thank you, everyone, for being part of the solution, because we can't do this work without you.
Take care and stay safe.